universal, I could say something about universality. So I decided to talk about self-awareness. So my research is in AI, machine learning, and cognitive science. NSF, because we're here at NSF has a program for artificial intelligence called, oh, sorry about that. Hello? This works, yeah. NSF has a program called Robust Intelligence. And to my mind, one of the most important things that we can do to get AI systems to be more robust is to have some sense of self-awareness, some ability to model what their own abilities are, what their own limitations are, and what their current state is, if you wish. So I have been thinking about self-awareness. It's a little bit easier term to talk about than consciousness, which is, of course, very fraught and philosophical. So I won't mention consciousness, but I'll try and define self-awareness and talk about some ideas about how it arises in various complex adaptive systems. So a working definition of self-awareness is a dynamic representation that a system would have about its global state arising from statistics of lower-level components. So in complex systems, we talk about emergence of global properties from low-level components, and I think self-awareness is one of those properties that's not just appears in the brain, but in many complex systems in nature. So this representation that a system has of its global state can feed back to adaptively control the lower-level components. This is something that Jessica talked about in her talk. And one of the main reasons for it is it can ensure that appropriate resources in the system get to the right place at the right time. So space and time are actually very important in these systems. So instead of looking at the brain, because that's very complex, I'm interested in thinking about some other complex systems. So I decided, since I only have 10 minutes here, I'll talk about the immune system and ant colonies, because those are some systems that I've been had some great discussions about. So the immune system, a lot of my ideas came from many, many discussions with a fantastic immunologist named Lee Siegel that many of you know. He passed away a few years ago, but he was extremely thoughtful about how the immune system might have its own sort of self-awareness. Its requirements are to dynamically generate and use appropriate lymphocytes at the right place and the right time in the body. But although the environment is continually changing, the environment of pathogens and other things that are going on in the body, and has conflicting requirements. That is, we want to take out the bad stuff, but don't harm the body. And that's a very difficult sort of trade-off that doesn't always work. And in ant colonies, a very similar kind of requirement is to allocate ants, or the agents of the system, to needed tasks at relevant locations in a continually changing environment. So there's similar requirements. And so if we talk about mechanisms, well, an important mechanism in the immune system, and the cells are distributed throughout the body, and they randomly and locally sample information. So they are distributed. They can't see the whole picture, but they have to sort of locally sample by looking at the cells that are around them, looking at concentrations of pathogens and signals from other cells. They produce what Lee Siegel called diffuse feedback. For instance, there's all kinds of chemical signaling that has to do with sampling concentrations rather than direct signaling between cells. And there's diffuse feedback of many kinds, and this causes probabilistic modification of cells and cell concentrations. So the cells themselves undergo a kind of Darwinian selection for cells that match certain pathogens that are the right cells for this particular state of the system, are able to be modified and also to proliferate. And in ant colonies, then this kind of cycle is just continual. So you think this is a very different kind of thing than we have in today's artificial intelligence, because in most artificial AI systems, like in deep neural networks, there's very little dynamics. There's very little, I mean, it's kind of like everything is being looked at all at once in a feed-forward way, rather than this kind of distributed, decentralized, diffuse dynamics that you might see in these biological systems. And out of this comes what you might call an emergent collective self-awareness. The system has, as a whole, has some kind of model of its own state. And in ant colonies, you can make an analogy, really, with all of these different things when you think about how ants are doing task switching in response to their encounter with local random encounters with other ants, and local feedback from the environment, diffuse feedback of such as pheromone concentrations, and probabilistic modification of what the individual agents are doing. So a few observations. I mean, this is obviously, in a 10-minute talk, you can't really get into a lot of details, but I hope I give you the kind of flavor of what's going on here. And just some observations to me that are particularly interesting. One is that randomness and probabilities are absolutely essential part of the way the system is able to operate. They use randomness and stochastic processing in many different ways. And it's a way that a comparatively small population of simple components, and when we have trillions of cells in the immune system and millions of ants in an ant colony, for example, but this is small compared to the number of possible states that they have to explore, that they have to be able to sample. And being able to use this kind of stochastic approach is absolutely essential for that. You can't do an exhaustive search. And also, we often talk about the fine-grained character of complex systems, that we have simple, many simple components that are together collectively doing some kind of information processing. Why is it that these systems are so fine-grained in nature? Well, there's many reasons, redundancy, and some arguments for reliability. But one thing that I think is important is that this fine-grained nature means that each individual is able to do some kind of exploration, sample information that may not turn out to be useful. And many different simultaneous explorations can take place in a fine-grained system that a sort of more coarse-grained system kind of has to go all in one particular direction. And the other thing about a fine-grained system is it's able to quickly reallocate its resources much more quickly than a coarse-grained system. So this is kind of a claim that I see as very important for adaptivity and self-awareness in these systems. And also there's a continual interplay of what you might call bottom-up and top-down processes that involve random exploration on the one hand and expectation-driven, what you might call exploitation on the other hand, things that the system expects versus things that the system experiences. So finally, you might ask, okay, I'm using this term self-awareness, which is kind of a term we use in cognitive sense, but these aren't cognitive systems, right? Why am I calling it self-awareness rather than self-regulation via multiple feedback systems or something like that? And are these systems actually really self-aware in the way that the brain is? Is this like a good analogy or not? And I think they are, and would argue that they are, but I think it is an open question. And we'd have to answer, where is the self located in any of these systems? But I would argue that if there's something more to the self-awareness in the brain than this, it has to be elucidated, and I don't think it has been. So it's useful to think about these other systems when we're thinking about self-awareness, and to say, what is it that we are talking about in the brain, and why is it important, and how do we achieve it in the artificially intelligent systems we're trying to build? Okay, thank you.